Now, Dynasty is hard enough as it is with so many things outside of your control. However, there might be some things that you might be doing that you don't even realize is a huge mistake that's keeping you away from winning championships. Zach and I are going to be running through several Dynasty mistakes that are keeping you away from Dynasty championships and how to fix those mistakes going forward. Before we get into it, I do hope y'all enjoy the video. Please leave a like if you do, comment down below your thoughts on the video itself, and be sure to let us know what Dynasty mistake you're trying to avoid and maybe some of these mistakes you made yourself that you're not going to make in the future. But hey, with all that said, let's get right to the content you came for and get you one step or several steps closer to winning that championship someday. All right, Zach, so we're diving into some post-draft, post-rookie draft, or maybe even just in general offseason Dynasty mistakes. Most rookie drafts have come and gone, but there are still a fair few on the way. But we still want to be prepared for what mistakes might be ahead of us. And the first one I have is after your rookie draft, a lot of teams are going to be a little bogged down with roster space if you weren't good about managing your roster throughout the draft process. If you had a ton of picks, if you had a ton of players stashed already, you might just have a lot of players. But I have to really hammer home the point of don't make cuts. You don't have to. Keep value on your roster. Having value on your roster will eventually equate to fantasy production, which leads to championships. And, you know, I know you're going to touch on this a little bit, but some players are absolutely just waiver wire fodder, and you shouldn't let them take up that space on your roster. But with players that do hold more value, please do your due diligence to make sure you're trying to gain some value before cutting these guys. Trade players for draft capital, trade players to pick flip for draft capital next year. You know, move that third for a second, that fourth for a third, anything you can do. And go make some tier up trades if you have the depth to cover that kind of move. You know, go pair a quarterback 2 and a wide receiver 2 to go get a quarterback 1 or a wide receiver 1, something along those lines. You know, there are valuable ways to get players off your roster, and then there's just cutting players that shouldn't be cut. And ultimately, the more value you maintain, in my opinion, the more assets and more, you know, however you can build out that pieces on your team for the long haul, the longer and probably more powerfully your roster will flourish. Zach, I want to hear your thoughts on this concept.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great point, and it's something we're going to talk about how to toe the line on both sides. But just in terms of making cuts, you don't have to. You don't have to set a lineup until September. But at the same time, you don't want to miss out on players that are available now on the waiver wire. So I agree with you there. But at the same time, what we don't want to do, Bob, is be beholden to talent that we think is going to flourish. You know, you have to look at some of the analytics of some of these things, like do third-year day 3 wide receivers break out. So I'm just bringing up random examples here, but you don't want to be I know that fantasy is a very emotional game at times, right?
Yep.
That's why we love being on the clock. We love draft picks. We love that high of, oh, I drafted this player and I'm going to be right on him. But at the same time, if the opportunity isn't there, if the player got another position drafted by that team, like, let me give you an example, like Jalen Naylor, for example, of the Vikings.
Great example.
He was in line to be the wide receiver 3. They drafted Jordan Addison. You can move on from Jalen Naylor. You don't have to be the guy that was right on Jalen Naylor. You don't have to hold. And sometimes, and I've said this on our shows a lot of times, you just have to say to yourself, I'm willing to be wrong on this player. So, you know, don't be beholden to some of the players that are on your roster. You know, make sure that you are trimming the excess fat, as we also say at certain points, because you want to be able to capitalize on other opportunities, whether it's the waiver wire, whether it's trades. You want to make sure that you're making good decisions on that point and not just being, well, this guy, I really like this guy a year or two ago. Like, it's not there. So it's a fine line between what you're saying, where you don't make cuts, you don't have to, but don't just fall in love with a player emotionally. Ask yourself, is there opportunity? Is there a reasonable chance that this player is going to give you fantasy production? And if not, you have to move on, because you have to churn that wheel at the bottom of your roster, and you have to have room on your roster to do that as well. So it's a fine line between the 2 points we're talking about here, Bob.
Yeah, a great way to keep yourself in the middle of leagues, and not even necessarily the bottom of your league, but possibly even worse, being in the middle, is holding out hope for these kinds of players and not trying to turn them over for a new opportunity and things like that. It's a great point. I'm sorry, there does just come a time where if they haven't showed any signs of life, you know, much, if at all, it's just time to move on from guys like that just haven't done a whole heck of a lot for you up to this point. especially when you have new talent coming in. There's no reason not to try to shift some of that talent, trade in some of that talent for just a new opportunity. Let's move on to this next one. And this was very apparent even in the pre-draft process when we thought there were a lot of running backs that were safe. We thought Travis Etienne was pretty safe, especially when they brought in Dearness Johnson to be, what we thought was going to be a competent second fiddle. Then they go and draft Tank Bigsby. No one thought Kenneth Walker was in trouble going into this draft. Everybody's like, hey man, he's locked in Dynasty RB5. Everybody's good. We need to be very cautious when it comes to preseason buys, off-season buys in general at this point, particularly when we're looking for points this year. We obviously want to improve our roster, and sometimes we want to, just get that deal done if we can, as soon as we can. But we want to improve our roster and particularly our starting lineup before the start of the regular season. And in my opinion, unless you're getting a great value that you can't pass up on, DK Metcalf for a second-round pick, stupid values, not anything realistic, but like stupid value, I'd advise proceeding with some caution. You only have so many assets to acquire players with, and adding someone now at the same cost it will likely cost you later when there's more time for them to get hurt in the interim just isn't worth it unless you're acquiring at good value, like I mentioned. Zach, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this point, being cautious in the preseason when it comes to these preseason buys.
This is a very interesting point because I'm looking at some of my leagues now, Bob, and trying to see where I can address some positions. And sometimes it's just best to do that week one of the regular season, right? Like, why put yourself in a situation to buy someone who then 2 weeks later gets hurt? I'll give you a great example. I was new to the Dynasty format 2 years ago, and I bought Odell Beckham before the Super Bowl.
Rough.
Like, that's even taking it to another, like, don't buy players when they're still playing in the playoffs and your fantasy season is over. So it's the same thing there, though. It's the same thing applies. Like, wait till week one, wait till preseason week 4 when starters are most likely not going to play, because if you buy guys in OTAs in week 1, you're giving an opportunity for that player to get hurt, and then you're going to be looking for another player in another week or two. So it's a great point. I think the Odell Beckham Jr. thing was hilarious. And yeah, like, just, it's a great point by you, Bob, and it's something to keep in mind when you're trying to fill out your roster, but it's not necessarily something you have to do until the first week of September.
The reason I put this right before the next point is because it leads into this one very well. Until it's week 1 and you believe you're a competitive team, you have zero team needs right now besides talented players. Filling a competitive lineup across all positions someday should be your ultimate goal. But if you're still rebuilding and not trying to win this year, I'm not going to stress over every position, particularly running back, seeing how volatile they're becoming. If I have somebody, a competent wide receiver too, like if I have a couple of Khalil Herberts kicking around, I'm fine with that. I'm not going to look to address much beyond that outside of maybe some depth or some pieces that aren't getting onto the field, things like that. But if I'm competitive or a couple lineup pulls away from that, I'm monitoring the market and waiting for more opportunity to fill my lineup gaps at good value, as opposed to just blowing my load to fill a spot now to feel good about my lineup in May. I'm not worrying about that. I'm not worrying about it in June, July, or August, unless the value, like I previously mentioned, is just really stinking good. DK Metcalf for a second good, for some reason, that's my benchmark for good value, like stupid good value today. But I'm not rushing to do so to put myself at risk for an injury that takes that player out of my lineup at the cost of the assets I sent to acquire that player. And now that's not saying like not all injuries will last an entire season. Not every injury is going to be an ACL, but I got that player to utilize that player. And, the thing is with injuries is a lot of times the injury outlasts the impact of the injury kind of outlasts how long they're out for. Sometimes it takes them a couple of weeks to get back to full health, where a 4-week injury is really hurting you for like 6 weeks, kind of a thing like that. Remember, just because you have a hole to fill in your lineup, it also doesn't increase the market value of the piece you're trying to acquire to fill it. You shouldn't be paying more than market value for a player just because it does you a lot of good to fill a hole in your lineup. You shouldn't go and pay double 50% more market value for a player just because they're filling your lineup slot and makes your lineup look pretty. And I would even go as far to say, with these last 2 points, kind of wrapping them both together, it might be best process to not actually trade to fill your lineup gaps until week 1 at the earliest.
Mm-hmm.
And then when you absolutely need it, if you're coming up close to the trade deadline, you will get in the argument of, well, you're going to have to pay more closer to the trade deadline because you're kind of in that arms race where you could be bidding against other competitive teams. But it might just be safer process to not put yourself at the detrimental risk of buying these players at the same value you'd buy them for later in the season if they're not doing that much more for you. But it's kind of a catch-22. You're missing out on production in the interim, but you're also saving yourself from possibly losing assets and not having that player throughout that interim anyway. So it's kind of a tough spot to be in, Zach. I know you got some points here.
Well, the first thing is, like you said, you can go out and try to address areas of need now, but you don't want to overpay. What is going to happen in the next few months, Bob, is nothing is going to happen in the NFL, and people are going to get bored.
Sure.
And they're going to start listing players on the trade block. Now, you have to look at opportunities where teams may be trying to pull one over you. They're 5 players over the roster limit. They're going to try and trade 2 for 1. You have to make sure that you know what's going on both ends here. But I love what you said there about, we talked about that before, waiting until week 1. I love this point, and just make sure that you are patient with this process, because in June and July, when there's nothing happening in the NFL, people are going to get bored, and they're going to start putting players on the trade block, boop, 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 boop. And now you can start these conversations to where you may be able to capitalize on somebody who's just bored.
Touching on the point of, leagues are going to get a little quiet. It's going to be a little boring because not a lot's happening in the NFL. Teams aren't blocked from making moves at this point. Dalvin Cook could get moved. Zeke could get signed. Leonard Fournette could be signed. All of these have pretty dramatic impacts wherever they end up or whatever happens. So while it's easy to tune out now, which is the next point, after the rookie draft, especially when you have one in May or even June, so much time between events, when you have to go start setting lineups or preseason happens, whatever the case is, when there's so much time in that middle, it's easy to kind of tune out, but you really need to make an effort to stay plugged in. You need to keep an eye on who's getting cut and what rookies don't get drafted that you might want to add. Say not all drafts are like 4 or 5 rounds. There are plenty of drafts that are 3-round drafts that are, normal rookie drafts, and plenty of players that would have gone in the 4th and 5th don't get drafted. There's going to be guys out there that are worth grabbing. Players are going to look at their teams and they're going to see, okay, who do I want to move and what kind of moves do I want to make? You're going to touch on some of these points going forward too, but they're going to put players on the trade block and they're going to be looking to move those players. When you put players on the trade block, not a lot of people are I'm just throwing them out there to see what I can get for him. That's sadistic and rude, if you ask me. But people are putting players on the trade block because they want to move them. They are accessible at this point. So see how people are feeling about their teams after the draft and certain players after the NFL and rookie drafts. Teams could have a different outlook for their team after their rookie draft, and this could put them in positions to make moves that fit a new trajectory than you maybe planned for them or they had planned for them. And remember, you can try to project another team's trajectory and thought process, but at the end of the day, the best source for that intel is that team manager themselves, because you can look at this team and be like, man, I think this team is dog water. And then all of a sudden, this team is making moves like they're a competitive team, like they think they're going to do more than win 3 games this season, and then they're trading for Dalvin Cook. What? Things like that just don't make sense for what their trajectory is. And you may not agree with it, and I don't typically agree with it when I see a team and I'm like, buddy, I don't know how to tell you. I don't think you're heading the right way, or I don't think you're heading that way. This could be all the more reason to go and buy in on their future draft capital if you don't believe in that. Making moves that, say you are rebuilding, giving them a player that you feel like might be heading on the downward for future draft capital for that team could be a chance for you to kind of sell out to improve a pick later, or just add to your draft pool, whatever the case is. But after every draft, managers will want to move players, but you can't jump on these opportunities if you're not there. This also goes for keeping a pulse on the preseason process. Where is Zeke going? Where's Leonard Fournette going? Is Dalvin Cook getting traded? Is Austin Eckler getting traded? Who's getting hype in the preseason, rookies wise, or young stashes? Who can you add off the waivers to flip for a profit or hold for upside? Zach, you have a couple nice points to follow up to this one with. Go ahead, dive into these, and tell me what you got.
Yeah, you said right there, stay apprised of the preseason news. And I think a majority of the people that are watching this operate their fantasy leagues on Sleeper. Sleeper has a great little
Mhm.
tab on the right side of the screen. If you go, I think, trending or whatever it is,
Yep.
they tell you like the top 50 players that are trending. And a lot of times they'll have news points on them right now. And like as of recording this, the number one player on that list is what, Deneric Prince? Is that his name?
Probably.
For good reason. There's just so much. The beat writers are writing about him. Andy Reid talked about him today. I know it's a convoluted backfield, but this was Isaiah Pacheco a year ago. So be apprised of that player. Be apprised of what's going on in the news, because this may be a player that may not contribute early on in the preseason, but towards the end of the season, he may contribute. Somebody else may want him and offer you a draft pick for him. We've seen these situations, like you and I did this with Brock Purdy last year, where you picked up Brock Purdy and I traded for him from you. So in a league that we're in. So this is the season where there's going to be some separation between the real Dynasty fantasy football players and the people who are just casually in it. And if you're watching this channel and you're watching it every day and you're in our Discord and part of our Patreon, it's because you eat, live, and breathe Dynasty Fantasy Football. And these few months, they're not going to make or break a championship team, but they'll help you that much more, maybe win a game, maybe turn a piece into a draft pick, maybe turn a player into another player that you've been trying to get and you haven't been able to acquire. So stay apprised of what's going on in training camps, OTAs, injuries, now, and specifically in July and August when all that information is coming out, because being on top of that news will have you that much more ahead of the game of other people. These are situations you want to be aware of in May, June, July. Who's a team's wide receiver 2? Who's a team's wide receiver 3 that's available on the waiver wire? Because there are players that are going to be available that you never think of. So just being on top of that information makes you that much more better than everybody else in your league.
I think a nice thing to add in, we've touched on this before, is you said these type of moves won't make or break a championship run. And you're right. But doing these type of things where you're just going the extra mile over and over is the concept of compounding consistency. Being consistent, being active, and being just trying to do your due diligence to be that much better will eventually put you, doing that over and over and over and over will put you over your league mates sooner rather than later. And I'm not saying, please don't ignore your families or anything like that. Don't ignore your day job. Just when you got a minute, take a look. Take a look at one team a day, and just see, depending on how many leagues you're in, obviously, if you're in 20 leagues, please, find a way to filter things out and do things as efficiently as possible, I guess. But if you're only in a handful of leagues, take the time, like you said, to go and look at these teams. And we're going to talk about that even a little bit more now, but staying on top of these things. Zach, dive into your next point here.
I know it seems a little bit early for this. We've talked about, potentially looking at your team and not necessarily addressing team needs. Well, other teams aren't going to do that. And so you need to look throughout your league and see what teams need what positions. Does a certain team need a quarterback? Does a certain team need a tight end? And do you have a surplus at that position that you could exploit that now? We're saying to you, don't go out and buy a quarterback if you need a quarterback right now, because that's what other people do. And so you could be the one on the other end of that, exploiting that situation. There are situations in your leagues where other dynasty owners didn't address who they needed to address in the busiest time of the dynasty offseason, which is April and early May, when your rookie draft has not happened yet, but it's coming up, and during your rookie draft. And so now you go to that team owner and say, hey, it looks like you need a quarterback. I got Matt Stafford. What can we work out here? He helps you out and be honest with the owner too. Like this helps you out for a year. I'm rebuilding. This doesn't help me out. What can we work out here? Have those conversations in your league. And even if it doesn't amount to a move now, you might plant that seed in that owner's head in July and August when he still hasn't acquired a quarterback and he needs one. He's like, well, Matt Stafford's available. Let me go see what I can do there. So having that research and having those conversations and dialogues in your league, they can't hurt you at the very least.
Yeah, I did a video a while back during one of our live streams. It's a live stream cut up, and it was just called How to Create Trades. One of the number one points is knowing the needs of your league mates. Because if you can go to them where they have a need that you have a surplus at a position of, you automatically have leverage in a deal to make a trade with them. Because you have something that hopefully is a shiny enough of an object that they want, but it's also a need. So then you have this and that, both things. And then you can utilize that. That's a surplus for you to fix an additional position that you need. That might be a surplus for them, and make both teams better. Another thing in that point was you are eventually going to try to make both teams better, because if you're not doing that, you're just not going to get a lot of trades done. You're not going to be able to pull the wool over everyone's eyes and make trades that you shouldn't, or that shouldn't be able to happen.
Mm-hmm.
That's just not going to be a consistent thing to happen. You'll get away with one. You'll get silly offers in your inbox that you just see and you're like, I need to double check that I'm not sending Will Fuller for Chris Godwin, or I'm not getting Will Fuller for Chris Godwin. It's happened though. I love this point, identifying the team needs in your league of other teams, not only your own. Again, just doing more due diligence to have more research done on the league, be a student of the league.
The other thing that I put in our show notes and didn't address here, something we talk about prior to the trade deadline in your seasons, is you don't want to be the second team to be rebuilding and start selling off assets. You don't want to be the second team. You don't want to miss out on somebody else's decision to start addressing those needs. If they need a quarterback and somebody else made that trade, then you've lost out. So you don't want to be the second team to help that team out.
I love this point, Zach. This is such a dang good point. And staying plugged in when a player goes up on the trade block, being the first person in that person's DMs. When you see a need and that team is actively kind of like, if they post in the chat, like, hey, looking for a quarterback, that DM should be sent, basically. Because once they've filled that need, that's a lost opportunity. That's a great point. And lost opportunities do pile up. And the less you miss out on, the better your team's going to be in the long haul, because you're making the most of every opportunity and doing your due diligence and being a student of your league. Speaking of being a student of your league, Zach, talk about this next point. Beautiful point. Always love points like this. Get into it.
Yeah, this is going to seem way out there, but again, we're talking about what's going to separate you from the rest of your league, and having that 2024 information is going to start making you better than your league mates, and not specifically the players, but the positions and the strengths. And I always talk about draft classes and their positional strength and their positional weakness, because you need to know. And it's probably a little hard to do that right now, but you can start doing the homework and you'll get a better idea in August and September of the positional strength of the future draft class. It's way too early to know, but does it look like a strong quarterback class? Does it look like a weak wide receiver class? What does your team need? Do you have 4 first-round picks and you really need wide receiver, and next year doesn't look good at wide receiver? All right. What do we start doing with those picks? Are we going to wait? Find those positional strengths and those positional weaknesses. How do they align with your team needs in a year? And how can you address that? Is the draft going to be an avenue for you to address your team? Or do you need to start say, hey, and this is probably something you do later. You don't start doing this now, because those 2024 first round picks gain more value as the season starts, as the playoffs come to fruition. And as we get into the offseason is, hey, I have these picks. Trust me, nobody knows the positional strengths and weaknesses of the future draft class like you're going to know. And what deals can I make? What players can I make? Bob, I had so many second-round picks in drafts this year in our league as well, and no first-round picks. And I absolutely loved it, because I was soaking up so much value where I didn't think value was to be had in the end of the first round of rookie drafts this year. So that could be you with a little bit of research in the future as well.
Yeah, I think that's one of your finer points, and not to say the other ones that you make aren't, but that's definitely a finer point of yours, is lining up a weakness of yours with the strength of the draft class, and taking your team weaknesses and making sure that, whatever the draft weaknesses are, filling those before you get to the draft, because the draft ain't going to do much for you if that's the case. And I mean, if you want to be able to build for the long term, and build short term as well, you're going to need to know these things and be on top of these things, and, kind of setting up whatever you can do to make those holes align the best you can going forward. But absolutely start doing that 2024 research and start getting those picks, or figuring out what moves you need to make to avoid the weaknesses in that draft and fill them on your roster first, and fill your weaknesses in your roster before you rely on the weaknesses of the next draft class. Wrapping all of this up into one, And I think the big mistake here in the offseason in general, especially right now, is failing to seek out opportunities to exploit and create value for your team. Now, this should be an all-the-time mindset. This shouldn't just be well, the rookie draft is over, I need to go exploit and create some value. It should be done in season, should be done in the offseason, before the draft, offseason, after the draft, at all times. Value farming, value scouting. How can you find value? How can you create it? Who can you move on from that has an inflated value right now for somebody who's locked into similar production for something on top of that player as well? And then who can you acquire cheaply because someone is panicking about a player's situation? Someone who I think fits that bill soon is going to be Kenneth Walker. You know, we touched on him at the start of the video. I think Kenneth Walker at some point is going to be a tremendous value because everyone is panicking about what Zack Charbonnet is going to do. I don't think there's a world right now where Kenneth Walker is just going to, run off the face of the earth and be a nothing running back anymore. I don't think Zack Charbonnet is taking the bulk of the workload in that backfield. And then you just mentioned, how can you get a head start on improving next year's draft capital? All of these things, all of these little things, who can you get at a decent value? Who can you send a second round pick for that you can get reliable production out of? If your rookie draft hasn't happened yet, try throwing a late second round pick for someone like Tyler Lockett, who at least for the front end of the season, probably going to be pretty solid. There's speculation that the Seahawks are going to be switching to an 11 personnel to have more wide receivers out there. Makes sense when you draft a wide receiver at 20th overall. So that could be a case where Tyler Lockett's still able to get his. All of these things, seek out those opportunities to exploit and create value. Zach, let's wrap this thing up. What else do you got for these points? Dynasty mistakes.
No, I think that you put a nice little bow on it. And we talked about, I love that you mentioned earlier, compounding these difference makers, right?
Yep.
This plus this plus this plus this. It's not going to win you a championship, but it can put you in line to be better positioned to win a championship in the future. Some people get lucky and win a championship, and some people do homework and research the weather on that day in Cleveland to know if it's too windy to start Donovan Peoples-Jones or Amari Cooper or not. Those are things that will separate you. Those kinds of decisions will make the difference between where you are now and where you want to be in the future. And of course, making good decisions in some of these places and trades and stuff like that. Like, these are not a direct line to win, but they will put you in a better position to align yourself to a championship in the future in your dynasty league, and hopefully for years to come, because that's what we're all trying to do. We're all trying to build a dynasty team in our dynasty leagues.
Yeah, and I think, putting all these points together over time just make it that much better over time. And that's what we're trying to do, like you said. Over time, we're trying to become better, win more, have more fun because we're winning more. I know I'm too competitive to sit there and lose every Sunday unless it's an intentional rebuild. So all of these little things, while they're not, none of these are a silver bullet, but all of these together make for some pretty nice ammunition. While that is it for the video today, I do hope you all enjoyed. Please leave a like if you did. Comment down below your thoughts on the video itself. Be sure to let us know what mistakes you're no longer going to be making in the Dynasty offseason. And be sure to drop any Dynasty mistakes we might have missed that you would want your fellow Dynasty players to learn as well. And if you enjoyed this video and you want to learn more about the do's and don'ts of Dynasty Fantasy Football, I highly recommend checking out this playlist up here where we dive into so many Dynasty strategies and best practices and best processes to eventually win your league someday. But hey, that's going to be it for us today. We will see y'all in the next one. But until then, y'all have a good one.